Hello. Today we're going to share the information of how to use trucking fatigue meter from a fleet insight perspective as a safety officer might do for any trucking organization. Fleet insight is going to allow you to see all the historical information about the fatigue of your drivers based on whatever time frame you're looking to analyze. For the sake of today's example, we're going to change our date range and we're going to say, let's look at the fatigue of this month. So I'm going to select that, and the system's going to present all of the information about the fatigue analytics of your drivers over that period. What you see here is on the left, I'm presently highlighting the organizational group, but I can also look at any of the lower level teams of drivers that comprise my organization. If I'm the safety officer, then I care about my organization. What I see here is everybody, and this is ranking all of my drivers from the person with the most average fatigue to the person with the least. And what that's going to allow me to do is tailor my fatigue education to those drivers who seem to have trouble keeping their fatigue risk in check. So very quickly I can identify who those drivers are. I can also see the number of driving events that they've had to know whether they've been busy or not. I can see the peak fatigue they've had during any of those driving events. And of course, when you see numbers like 25 and so forth, that's quite high. I can also see that for this average of 11, how different is that than a rolling 30-day average they've had over the course of all of the monitoring. And the higher the deviation, of course, that means there's something more rigorous in this time frame than what's typical. And that might be indicative of a change in work responsibilities, a work shift change, things of that nature that themselves could be troublesome from a fatigue perspective. The next thing I want to do is I want to look at my groups. Now you'll notice that people here are popping with red, where at the organization level they weren't with red. That's because the organization has one threshold of fatigue, and each of these other groups may have a different level of fatigue threshold. So when you exceed the threshold for that group, of course, it's red. Similarly, with the Southeast group, it's a different threshold as well. So if I look at the Northeast group, what I see here is 3 of the 4 drivers have an average fatigue score that's above the threshold for this group. Obviously, that's a challenge. That would say either the threshold is too low for this group, and therefore it's not indicative of the kind of driving that they're doing, or we have a real fatigue education issue that we have to tackle, and that would be something that we want to understand. To learn more about that, I would want to look at each driver. So I'll click here at Lara, and what I'm presented with is the representation of their daily logs. And you can see there's a lot of red on this slide because this driver has a lot of time above the fatigue threshold. So what you see is this block, light gray represents on duty, dark gray represents driving, and blue represents our system's estimate of when this driver likely slept. And what you see here as the blue is shifting from right to left day by day is this driver's work pattern is shifting. And like jet lag, when you fly across multiple time zones, that would have an effect on the fatigue as your body tries to keep up with that. And I can look week by week. I can step through this to see how did that change, and you can see this is quite a bit different than the prior week. The third week, okay, now I start to become more stable and for the most part sleep from early morning to just after the morning rush. And then the following week after that, very similar, although it's very erratic. So this would be an indication that this driver has gone through a very asynchronous driving duty period, and that might be something as an organization I can work on. The biology of a person likes to be consistent. I can also go back to the start of the time frame and look at this from a fatigue trend standpoint. And when I do that, again, these are the duties. This is the driving period. These are the duties, and blue is the sleep. And what you see here is when they don't get enough sleep, the second day is a little bit higher than that day. And if you still don't get enough sleep, it's a little bit higher yet. But then when you start getting more and more sleep, your fatigue starts to trend downward again. And you can see this week in and week out, kind of how the trends for a driver's fatigue is evolving. And that's going to help you better articulate how a consistency of sleep and the amount of sleep is important to keeping the fatigue levels at a more reasonable level. And again, week by week. So then what I want to do back at my Fleet Insight is get an idea of what the distribution looks like. So I can click here on distribution, and I can see that for every day of driving over that period by all my drivers, I see how the peak fatigue level is happening at a certain level the most amount of time here. This shows me that the fatigue threshold is set as a 9, and there's a lot of driving that's happening above a peak level of 9. And that could be problematic, as I mentioned. I then might want to say, well, how is that different than the Southeast? So I'll click to Southeast, In here, the fatigue threshold is not set at the same level. It's set at 16 because this group might be comprised more of nighttime drivers. And if I set it there, I can see the majority is still happening back here between 5 and 12, and I have less happening out here in the red. Now, again, you can set your thresholds differently using this information because night drivers will inherently have higher fatigue risk because of the human biology than day group. So you want to set a level that's commensurate with the kind of driving that's happening so that it triggers the monitoring and proactive coaching that can happen by way of the dashboard. At the same time, you want to now track this over time to make sure that the monitoring is having the impact that you want. Ideally, you want to see less and less red on this kind of distribution curve. And that would be indicative of your monitoring actually working and reducing driver fatigue risk through time. And then again, also looking at the people who are having the fatigue risk, are fewer people being higher, month in and month out, which would be a good representation that your training is starting to pay off. And that concludes the Fleet Insight review of Trucking Fatigue Meter.